Since 1916, when they first appeared on the battlefield, tanks have evolved into crucial tools for armies of nations to win any war. Each nation had its own design aesthetic during World War II, when tank doctrine was still extremely varied. Today's tanks, usually Russian and Western tanks, are still influenced by their tank design principles. Tank enthusiasts frequently inquire as to why Russian vehicles are lighter and more compact than their Western counterparts. Make sure to stay tuned until the end to find out. Everything was in short supply after the war. A smaller tank uses fewer resources, requires less logistical support, and, in theory, has a higher chance of surviving combat. All were essential to Soviet tank designs and continue to have an impact on Russian design today. Compared to Allied tank designs, notably those created during the Soviet era, such as the T-62, T-64, T-72, T-80, and T-90, Russian tanks are typically less expensive, faster, and have lower silhouettes. The T-14 Armata breaks with tradition and aims to catch up with the current Western-style MBT design. To keep costs down during the Cold War, the Soviet Union produced smaller tanks. The smaller, lighter tanks can be easily moved by road or rail because the USSR couldn't support a large logistics train. Additionally, they were able to traverse all the tiny bridges spanning Eastern Europe's rivers. All of these characteristics suit the Soviet plan's offensive orientation. Because they would be on the defense and may retreat into their supply lines, Western tanks might be larger. Since there was no longer a need to create space for a loader to transfer ammo around, the crew compartment could be drastically reduced when the autoloader was introduced. They essentially made the tanks as small as they could, which resulted in a tiny turret by contemporary standards. The driver, gunner, and commander were the only members of the crew when the autoloader was introduced. The turret was essentially shrunk, resulting in a configuration that meets current standards. In addition to being lighter than Western tanks, Soviet tanks also had poorer armor. As opposed to the West's spaced arrays, the Soviet tanks used unique RHA layers and materials like Textolite. Because it was thinner than Western designs, this hull armor had to be slanted in order to be effective. But with the modern M829 APF-SDS, it was simply insufficient. For this reason, Russian tanks have armor that reacts explosively. Using Contact 5, which has a small internal volume and weight, improves protection. Due to the topography in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Soviets opted to offer smaller and more discreet tanks. The low profile gives the tank a clear edge over Western tanks in areas where they like it and works effectively in low terrain. On the other hand, keeping a low profile increases survival rates, at least on paper, but also makes for tight quarters within the tank. The placement of ammo, which is not isolated from the crew by a fireproof wall, is a major problem for all Soviet tanks. As a result, detonations of ammunition during actual conflict frequently resulted in the crew's complete loss, and confined conditions also made it difficult to flee quickly in the event of a fire. The basic traits of Soviet tanks are essentially carried over to Russian tanks, though the new Armata design suggests that this is changing. The T-90M, T-80BVM, and T-72B3 are all, in turn, larger tanks than their prior standards. But they still have a lesser overall size in comparison to Western tanks. In contrast to its predecessors, the Armata has an entirely new design. A challenge for any enemies will be presented by the next generation platform's active defense systems, which will stop rockets before they reach the tank. The Armata has been plagued by delivery delays and exorbitant prices, while looking excellent on paper. Only a few of the hundreds the Kremlin had planned to put out into use by now have been delivered. In general, the Russian emphasis is on the cost of large-scale production and the weight to make it appropriate for trains and tiny bridges, while the priority of the Western tank is the crew's capacity to survive. Now, you might be wondering if Russian tanks are superior to American tanks given that they're so much smaller. Although the design objectives for the two tanks are different, both are effective in their intended roles. American tanks are often built for protection, while Russian tanks are typically built for attack. It only implies that certain design choices were made that gave one priority over the other. Neither American tanks nor Russian tanks are incapable of attacking or defending. Russian tanks are superior to American tanks in a number of ways. The first is the design and profile of guns. A low profile prevents gun depression because the breech contacts the turret's roof. Both of these are mentioned here because they're related. American tanks often have high gun depression and are tall. Russian tanks have substantially less depression and are much lower. The benefit of gun depression is that it enables you to adopt hull-down positions where only your turret is exposed. Without adequate depression, you must leave your full tank exposed. Hull-down is crucial, but only when you're on the defensive. It's less of an issue if you're attacking because you are already moving quickly over wide terrain. A small tank is a smaller target in certain circumstances. The second factor we evaluate is armor versus precision. This is largely a technology issue. Hence, American tanks, specifically the Abrams, have an advantage in both scenarios. However, before that, there was the M60 against the T-64 comparison, in which the T-64 had at least twice the armor equivalent of the M60. Additionally, more recent Russian tanks with active defenses that are allegedly able to block both missiles and APFSDS are now on the market. In essence, Russians value armor more than precision, or perhaps more properly, Americans value protection less than Russians do. This is related to tank sizes in part, as the first consideration demonstrates. While smaller tanks require less protection, larger tanks do. We'll now discuss the third point, which is autoloaders. They're only used by Russians. An auto main loader's benefit is that it reduces the tank crew from 4 to 3 people. With the same number of crew members needed, they are able to have 33% more tanks. Due to the small size of Russian tanks, which forces the crewmen to be physically smaller than average, there is a limited supply of men who can serve as tank crewmen. For the assault, more tanks are needed. Americans have preserved the loader in part due to the fire rate. An experienced loader may easily defeat an autoloader, at least for a brief period of time, but an autoloader can outperform a fresh, unskilled, or barely trained loader. Gun size is the final factor on which we must emphasize. Russians frequently possess larger weapons than Americans do. Larger ammo sizes, which limit the number of rounds that can be carried and slow down the rate of fire, are a drawback of larger weapons that otherwise outperform smaller ones in terms of penetration and strong explosive effect. Therefore, it can be said that Russian tanks are superior when it comes to going on the attack and maintaining a lengthy, quick attack. The American tanks, however, excel at defensive maneuvers and maintaining a high rate of fire with pinpoint accuracy. Russia also has twice as many tanks as the United States, but does it matter? According to a report in TASS, the Russian news agency, Deputy Defense Minister Alexei Grivorushko stated that the military of his nation acquired up to 160 tanks during the first half of 2020, and it's unknown how many tanks they'll have accumulated by the end of 2022 and the start of 2023. The report states that many of the tanks are T-72B and T-80s that have been rebuilt, improved, and refurbished. Russia's 12,000-strong tank fleet is twice as large as the 6,000 tanks owned by the United States, according to globalfirepower.com, which raises an intriguing issue regarding the likelihood of a protracted ground conflict. As a third-generation tank derivative of the 1980s-era T-72, the Russian T-72B is often compared to the years of advancements made to the American Abrams. The advent of additional Russian tanks prompts a thought-provoking query. How much of a difference would thousands of additional tanks make in a long-lasting ground conflict? Would that many tanks be wrecked throughout the course of a protracted ground battle, favoring an advancing Russian ground force in the end? It's interesting to note that the US possesses more armored vehicles overall than Russia, according to the Global Firepower Breakdown. Compared to Russia's 27,000 armored vehicles, 39,000 are operated by the United States. Nevertheless, it's impossible to ignore Russia's advantage of more than 6,000 tanks. However, any modern conflict would also significantly rely on air power, and the US possesses about 5 times as many helicopters and more than twice as many combat planes as Russia. Russian tanks are vulnerable to aerial attack should the US achieve air superiority, which might ultimately undermine which ground force wins on the ground. A RAND Corporation report from a few years ago claimed that an invading Russian land force could soon conquer the Baltics unless the US dispatches significant troops to the area, which may be one explanation for the significant tank advantage. Finally, how significant are simple numbers in any case? Does an army really need 12,000 tanks if it can field a sizable capable force? Wouldn't a tank's combat performance, range, precision, and survivability far surpass its sheer numbers? A single tank might defeat dozens of enemy vehicles if it possessed these sensors to locate and eliminate hostile tanks and armored vehicles at safe, standoff distances. Similar to the F-35 in the air, it's designed with numerous cutting-edge sensors and armaments in order to track down and shoot down numerous adversary aircraft before anybody notices them. Perhaps technical capabilities such as range, precision accuracy, air-ground coordination, and weapon efficacy might prove to be more important than numbers in modern warfare.